There is a kind of quiet suffering that never announces itself. A soft ache carried by those who smile, even when something inside them is breaking. People who say it's okay, even when it isn't. People who apologize for existing, for needing, for taking up space. Politeness is beautiful, until it becomes a shield that never comes off. Until being nice turns into being invisible. Most people never notice the emotional weight carried by someone who never says no. But inside them, a silent tension forms. A life lived in careful sentences, softened truths, and swallowed emotions. This is the quiet psychology behind always being polite. Not the sweetness people admire from the outside, but the hidden erosion happening within. There is a specific softness in people who are always polite, a certain gentleness, a way their presence feels calm, predictable, safe, but beneath that softness, there is a story no one asks about, because no one thinks they need to. People who are always polite often move through life like someone walking on eggshells, careful not to disturb, not to offend, not to take too much space in the room. Their words shrink to fit the moment. Their emotions fold themselves into quieter shapes. It starts subtly. A smile held a little too long. A no problem said too quickly. A discomfort swallowed before it even reaches the throat. From the outside, people admire their grace, their patience, their unwavering ability to stay calm even when the world around them becomes heavy. But on the inside, something different is happening. A slow and silent erosion. Because every time they say it sets fine, even when something inside them tightens, every time they hide their needs to protect someone else, sits comfort, a small part of them steps a little further away from their own truth. And no one notices. How could they? The polite person makes sure of it. They've learned how to smile through hurt, how to soften their voice even when frustration burns in their chest, how to hold doors open for others while quietly closing every door to their own needs. The world sees kindness, but what it doesn't see is the quiet loneliness that forms when someone is always agreeable. A loneliness made not from lack of people, but from lack of being known. Because politeness, when overused, becomes a disguise. A mask so gentle and so convincing that even the person wearing it begins to forget where the mask ends and where they begin. This chapter is the beginning of that journey. The moment where the polite smile stops being an act of kindness and becomes an act of self-disappearance. Patterns rarely appear out of nowhere. Even the gentlest behaviors have roots somewhere. In childhood, in culture, in the quiet emotional climate a person grew up inside. For many who become too polite, the story begins early. In homes where conflict was unpredictable, where anger arrived without warning, where speaking up only made things worse. A child in that environment learns something adults never say out loud. That harmony is fragile, and that their honesty can break it. So they adjust. They learn to watch faces carefully. They learn to measure their words. They learn to read the room before they even understand themselves. Politeness becomes protection. Obedience becomes safety. Agreeableness becomes the easiest way to avoid the storm. For others, the origin is quieter. Growing up in families where being good was praised more than being real. Where emotional expression was met with, "Don't sit, make a scene. Don't sit, be difficult. Don't sit, upset anyone." And so, the child becomes easy, pleasant, low maintenance. Parents, teachers, relatives admire them. You sit so well behaved. You never cause trouble. You search such a good kid. They hear these things often enough that a subtle message settles into their bones. Your value is in how little you need. Your worth is in how easy you are to manage. And this message follows them into adulthood. Culture can add its own weight too. Some societies hold politeness as a moral duty, a sign of respect, a measure of character. But when politeness becomes an expectation rather than a choice, It stops being kindness and becomes performance. By the time the polite person grows up, the pattern feels natural, automatic, as if it has always been part of them. But underneath, the truth is simple. This wasn't set a personality. It was a survival strategy. A child learned that their honesty created tension, so their adult self never learned how to use it. This chapter uncovers the soil where the habit was planted, long before the polite smile became permanent. There is a moment, often unnoticed, when a habit shifts from choice to instinct. For the overly polite person, this moment happens early, the day their nervous system decides that agreement is safer than honesty. Psychologists call it self-silencing, a reflex where the body responds to emotional discomfort the same way it responds to danger. Not by fighting, not by running, but by shrinking. One of the clearest explanations lies in what trauma specialists call the fawn response, a survival pattern where a person avoids conflict by appeasing others. It steps not intentional. It sits not manipulative. It's simply the brain choosing the path that feels least threatening. When someone grows up learning that disagreement leads to tension, the brain memorizes the lesson. Keep the peace at any cost. This creates a cycle where politeness becomes the default reaction, a shield the mind raises automatically before the person even realizes what they truly feel. They agree even when they want to decline. They apologize even when nothing is their fault. They soften their preferences, their tone, their presence, just to maintain emotional safety. Over time, the brain wires itself around this pattern. Neurons that fire together begin to fire automatically. What once required effort becomes instinct, and with instinct comes exhaustion. Because suppressing emotion takes energy, the nervous system works overtime, constantly scanning the environment for potential discomfort. A raised eyebrow, a disappointed sigh, a slight shift in tone. To others, these cues mean nothing, but to someone shaped by self-silencing, they feel like warning signs. So they swallow their reactions. They swallow their disappointments. They swallow their truth. Again and again. The silence becomes familiar, comfortable even, because it keeps the peace. Because it avoids conflict. Because it feels safer than honesty. But inside, something else is happening. A slow, quiet disconnect between what they show and what they feel. A separation so subtle that most people never notice, until the person themselves starts to feel hollow. This is the psychology beneath constant politeness. A nervous system trained to protect rather than express. At some point, the conflict moves inward, not between people, but within the self. It begins as a faint tension, a small tightening in the chest, when someone says, "Can you do this for me?" And the polite answer rises before the real one. Yes, of course. Words spoken quickly, effortlessly, almost rehearsed. Even when part of them whispers, "You stir tired. You stir overwhelmed. You don't ist want this." But the whisper is too soft. The pattern is too strong. This is the internal war of the overly polite person, the split between wanting and agreeing. On the surface, it looks peaceful. They nod. They smile. They comply. Inside, a different story unfolds. Every time they say yes when they mean no, a quiet resentment grows. Not always toward others, often toward themselves, for being unable to speak the truth. It sits a strange loneliness, to be surrounded by people, yet never feel seen by them, because the version of themselves they offer is edited, filtered, trimmed to keep everyone comfortable. And with every compromise, every softened truth, every swallowed emotion, the gap widens between who they are and who they feel required to be. Psychologists call this self-betrayal, a slow loss of authenticity, a distancing from one's own needs so deep that desire itself becomes blurry, At some point, the person can no longer tell whether they genuinely want something, or whether they simply train themselves to want whatever keeps the peace. This contradiction creates an emotional fatigue that's difficult to explain, a tiredness that doesn't come from work or effort, but from existing in a constant state of self-editing, because pretending to be okay is one of the most exhausting things a human can do. The war never looks dramatic. It has no shouting, no visible explosions, just a quiet daily tension, the subtle ache of a life lived in agreement. While the heart quietly longs for honesty, this chapter lives in that space, the widening distance between the person they show and the person they truly are. Every pattern has a breaking point, even the gentlest ones, even the ones built from kindness, softness, and good intentions. For the overly polite person, the moment doesn't always look dramatic. It often arrives quietly, like a realization that sneaks in through the back door of the mind. Maybe it happens during a small request they cannot meet. Something simple, something they've said yes to 1,000 times. But this time, their body hesitates before their voice can agree. Or maybe it comes after a long day of pleasing, adjusting, apologizing. When they finally sit alone and notice a feeling they rarely allow themselves to feel, exhaustion so deep it borders on sadness. Sometimes the moment is triggered by a relationship. Someone unintentionally takes advantage of their kindness. Someone assumes their silence means comfort. Someone keeps expecting more, because you never say anything. And suddenly the polite person realizes something painful. People have begun to treat them the same way they treat themselves, as someone who doesn't mind being overlooked. There are other moments too. Moments where their body tells the truth before their mind catches up. A tight jaw, a held breath, a wave of irritation that shocks them because they not used to feeling it. Resentment is often the first crack in the mask, not out of anger, but out of unmet needs that have been ignored for too long. And then there is the quietest breaking point of all, the realization that their relationships feel unbalanced, not because others are unkind, but because they have never given anyone a clear version of who they are. This is the turning point, not a moment of rebellion, not an explosion, just a soft but unmistakable awareness. I cannot keep disappearing like this. It sups a moment when the person finally sees the cost of their constant agreeableness, the emotional weight of politeness that was never meant to be carried alone. The mask doesn't shatter all at once. It cracks slowly, gently, honestly. And through those cracks, the first glimpse of the self begins to appear. When the realization settles that politeness has been a form of disappearance, something inside begins to shift, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a quiet, steady way that feels almost like waking up. This chapter is not about becoming bold or confrontational. It is not about unlearning kindness. It is about learning a gentler truth, that a person can be soft without softening themselves out of existence. The first signs of change are small. A pause before answering, a moment of checking in with the body, a question whispered internally. Do I actually want this? At first, the question feels strange, unfamiliar, like using a muscle that has long been asleep. Saying no feels even stranger. The word sits awkwardly in the mouth, unsteady, fragile, almost guilty. But even a gentle no carries power. Not the power to reject others, but the power to return to oneself. The polite person begins to notice that boundaries are not walls, but doors, ways of choosing when to open and when to stay closed. For the first time, honesty becomes an act of care, not only for others, but for the self that has been silent for so long. They learn that expressing discomfort does not make them unkind, that asking for space does not make them difficult, that having needs does not make them burdensome. Healing is not quick. It unfolds slowly, through conversations that tremble, through moments where the old instinct to please resurfaces, through nights where they replay interactions and wonder if they were too much. But each step, no matter how hesitant, is a step toward alignment. A life where words match feelings, where agreements are real, where kindness is no longer a mask, but a choice. Over time, they begin to feel something unfamiliar. Relief. The relief of being known. The relief of being understood. The relief of existing without apology. In this chapter, the self returns, not with force, but with a quiet, steady presence that finally feels like home. In the end, the journey isn't about abandoning politeness. It's about discovering the form of kindness that does not erase the self, because true kindness is not the absence of boundaries. It is not the suppression of truth. It is not the willingness to carry every emotional weight to keep others comfortable. Real kindness breathes. It has structure. It has honesty woven into it like steady threads. It does not bend until it breaks. As the overly polite person grows into this new understanding, something subtle begins to change in their presence. Their voice steadies. Their yes becomes intentional. Their no becomes respectful, not fearful. Relationships around them shift too. Some deepen, finally built on real communication, on mutual understanding, on the clarity that honesty brings. Other relationships fade quietly, not out of conflict, but because they were held together. Only by one person sits constant accommodation. In this balance, something beautiful emerges, connections that survive because they are honest, not because they are polite. The person begins to realize that they were never meant to live as a softened version of themselves. They were meant to stand whole, gentle yet grounded, caring yet truthful. They understand now that harmony created through silence is not harmony at all. That peace built on self-erasure is a peace that never lasts. And so, kindness becomes clearer, more authentic, more human. It becomes the kind of kindness that can say, I care and I cannot, in the same breath. The kind that honors others without abandoning the self. In the quiet of this realization, the world looks different, not harsher, but more balanced. Because for the first time, they are not choosing between being good and being real. They are learning that the most meaningful life is lived at the intersection of both. This is where the journey ends, with a kindness that no longer costs them themselves, and a self that no longer hides behind kindness.